Hi! In week 1 we have several vocabulary words to learn. We're going to start with language proficiency levels, English language learner, English as a second language, acquisition levels, input hypothesis, realia, which you will learn more about in the instructor guidance, language objectives, comprehensible input, making meaning in language, culture shock and stages, and the 4 domains of language, which you will also read more about in the instructor guidance. Additionally, based on your learning context or your teaching context, there's cultural knowledge, long-term ELLs, differentiated instruction, culturally responsive teaching, surface versus deep structure and culture, the I+1 theory model, Krashen's input hypothesis, Swain's output hypothesis, and interlanguage. Before we begin, I want to start with the language proficiency levels because it's very important to understand that when we're teaching English language learners in an English as a second language classroom, we need to understand what their proficiency levels are. Now, each state has language proficiency levels, or each university has language proficiency levels. Typically, they are based on TESOL, the TESOL organization, which is Teachers of English to Speakers of Other Languages, or the WIDA standards, which are the World-Class Instructional Design and Assessment, which is housed in Madison, Wisconsin. So when we're looking at these, we typically talk about language proficiency in a level 1 through level 6, with level 1 being entering. Now, if we look more closely at these proficiency levels, we will see that these are some things that we need to do and understand to help students, or things that they will be able to do. So pictorial or graphic representations of the language of the content area. So when we're thinking of beginning English language learners, regardless of if they're in the K-12 context or adult learning context, at this beginning level, they may not be doing much speaking at all. Words, phrases, or chunks of language when presented with one-step commands, directions, WH meaning the who, what, when, where, why, and how, choice of yes or no, or statements with sensory, graphic, or interactive support. This means that when ELLs are in that level 1 stage, we need a great deal of visual support with the language. We want to make sure that any time we are speaking or trying to have our students produce language, that we're matching language with graphics or something that's meaningful to help them understand the language. Oral language with phonological, syntactic, or semantic errors that often impede meaning. This means that when ELLs are speaking, they're going to have phonological, which are the basic sounds of the language, meaning they will mix up sounds. In many languages, the L, W, and R is very different than what we use in English, and those sounds may not exist in those other languages. In some languages, P and B are the same sound, or V and F are the same sound. So this will definitely be present when speaking English. Syntactic means grammar. So understanding the grammar of the language is very difficult for beginning ELLs, and this is when we need to be very patient in helping them understand. Semantic errors means word use, when to use specific words. And as any language learner knows, if you have been able to learn a language or study a language, in the beginning, when there are multiple words for one thing you want to say, we often mix those up. So that information can impede meaning it may make it very difficult for them to make themselves understood, and it is very, very frustrating. So when presented with basic oral commands, direct questions, or simple statements with sensory, graphic, or interactive support, the rule of thumb at this level is that we can expect 1 to 2, maybe 3 word responses. Probably not grammatically correct and with some word choice issues. That is why we are being very gentle when teaching at this level. Still at the level 2, we're still being very gentle. We're still having quite a bit of language issues, but we're able to pick up some general language related to the content area. We're picking up phrases or short sentences, and by short, I mean 3 to 4 words. Where is the bathroom? Put away your book. Take out your book. Can I go to the bathroom? So we're still working on those short phrases and sentences. Oral or written language with phonological, syntactical, or semantic errors that impede the meaning. So we still have these same issues going on. Then when we hit level 3, we're starting to see a little leveling out with the language. We have now general and some specific language in the content area. And if you're familiar with the BICS and CALP, which we will talk about soon, go ahead and write this down if you can. BICS are basic interpersonal communication skills. This is also referred to as playground language. This is information and language we pick up just from being around people, about the weather, about our daily events, about cars, or who to talk to, or where to find something. CALP then is that cognitive academic language proficiency. And so this is where we start seeing more of the specific academic language coming out in that level 3. We're still working on it in the levels 1 and 2, but we're going to start seeing our student using it more when they hit the level 3. We're still seeing oral and written language with some sound errors, some grammar errors, and some word choice errors. So that is okay. That is okay. We want students to hypothesize with the language. We want them to practice in a safe space that allows them to play with the language in order to understand when to use what. Now when we hit level 4, before we hit level 4 actually, level 3, it's helpful to know that students will stay in this area for quite a long time. In the K-12 sector, it is not unusual to have students stuck in this stage for 2 to 3 years, and it's normal. In the K-12 sector, we will often talk about a student being a 3.1 or a 3.2 all the way up to a 3.8 or 3.9. This helps us measure where in this scale they are. A 3.1 is going to tell us they're more at the beginning of this area. A 3.9 will tell us that they're getting ready to leap over into level 4, which is expanding. In level 4 now, we're looking at some specific and some technical language in the content area. Now the student is able to give us much more language, a variety of sentence lengths, varying linguistic complexity. So now what the student is saying and the vocabulary they're using is becoming more complex. Oral or written language with minimal sound, grammar, or word choice errors. So at this point, this is quite a leap for students. When they hit here, they've made it over a very, very difficult hump in language learning. And we celebrate here. Many school districts, if you're in the K-12 sector, will go ahead and exit students from the ESL program at a level 4. Many will wait till a level 5 or 6. Bridging then is the level 5, where we have specialized or technical language in the content area, a variety of sentence lengths, and written discourse. Now we're into stories, essays, and reports. So think of this in terms in the K-12, where now we're writing science reports and history reports, narratives and expositories, all sorts of varieties of writing. In the adult context, we now might be looking at business writing, academic essay writing. So that is where we are at in this level 5. Level 6 then is when we typically label a student fluent. So a specialized technical language reflective of the content area at grade level. And this could be in the K-12 or adult sector. At this point, they are writing, speaking, listening, and reading at a level that will be comparable to their English proficient peers. Okay? So that is a quick overview of the language proficiency standards, or the levels. So now when we get into these acquisition levels, we're looking for the students to acquire. So if a student is in level 1, we're looking for them to acquire a level 2. We want them to continue moving up that ladder. One of the first things that you will learn in teaching ESL is this input hypothesis. This was put forth by Stephen Krashen many years ago, and it is one of the go-to hypotheses that we look at in teaching English as a second language. What's really important about this is that here we have the student. Okay, and we're going to think of the student as having multiple boxes in their brain. Okay. What goes into the student needs to be comprehensible, at their level, and meaningful. So when we're teaching a student, if we are not hitting these components of comprehensible, on level, and meaningful, it is very difficult for them to show us what they know. So this input needs to be at their current level, which is I, and then we're going to add a level to it. This is what we call the I+1. We want to teach students at a level 1, if they're a level 1, but we want to add in some level 2 components, maybe some more challenging vocabulary, but we need to make sure it's meaningful and comprehensible. And you're going to learn many, many different ways of making language comprehensible throughout the course, throughout this course. And if you're an English Language Learner Studies major, then you will learn many more in all of the different domains. One way we can make information comprehensible is to use something called realia. Realia is a concrete piece of something, a concrete visual, or something tactile that can be used to teach students language. Now, I have often used videos, pictures, pens, whatever is needed. If you're talking about fruit, you might want to bring in the oranges and the bananas. So these would be considered realia because they're directly related to the vocabulary I'm teaching. Now, if you're teaching words like justice and honor and pride, those will be higher level vocabulary words that will require a different level of meaning and understanding. So those we will talk about as well, but understanding that the realia, we really need to use realia when we're talking about new vocabulary and concepts. It's very important that we're using something tangible to help our students learn. So we talked about this comprehensible input, which means input the student can understand, so that we're making the language meaningful. That is very important. Now, we need to do this in all 4 domains of language. So the 4 domains of language are reading, writing, listening, and speaking. And these are all very important to understand. It's also important to understand that when we're looking at these proficiency levels, a student may be a level 6 in listening, speaking, but may only be a level 3 in reading and writing. These 4 domains do not move up this ladder at the same pace. And if you're thinking about first language acquisition, we start listening and speaking long before we start reading and writing when we're children. So it makes complete sense that if we're thinking about the natural order of language development, that reading and writing will probably take a bit longer than listening and speaking. Think about how much comprehensible input you had in the first 5 years of your life before you started learning reading and writing. When you were a baby, if you wanted a bottle, your mom would show you a bottle and say, bottle. Juice. She would hold you juice, or your dad would hold juice and say juice. Everything we did as children typically used concrete visuals or realia to teach us the language. Now, even when we're looking at these 4 domains, we can break them into receptive and productive. Receptive then means to receive. Productive is to produce. So if we think about our language levels in terms of when students are receiving language and when they're producing language, receiving language will be listening and reading. Producing language will be speaking and writing. So not only do we have these 4 domains, and we have to think about the language levels of those domains, we also need to understand, are these receptive skills? Is the student needing to understand? Or are these productive skills when the student needs to be understood? That helps us some with how we're teaching and the strategies we use when we're looking at these different characteristics of language. Another thing we need to consider when we are working with ELLs is this interesting phenomena of culture shock. Now, this is something most everybody goes through at some point in their life. And you can go through this even if you're on a long vacation, or, for example, my daughter went to a German immersion camp over the summer at one point, and she had culture shock the first week. And so when they called me, being a language teacher, I was able to say, yes, it sounds like she's going through culture shock. And here's what I would recommend, knowing my child, how to help them through that culture shock. So when we're looking at it, there are 5 stages. We start at the honeymoon phase, and this is where we're in a new place, and it's exciting, and everything is great, and there's new people, and there are new experiences and new things to do. Then we hit the rejection phase. This is when the reality comes in. For adults, they now have to look for housing, they have to find a job, they have to also take care of this family while they're adjusting. It is very, very stressful. It can become very overwhelming. Things don't work out. People start to understand they are misunderstood. If kids are in a new school, this is the point where they're figuring out, this is not the greatest thing I thought it would be. Or if they were taught English in another country, they come here and quickly understand that the language they were taught is not necessarily the language that we're using, because they were taught a more formal English, but we use a great deal of slang, and we cut and splash letters or words together to make different words, and it's very confusing for students. Here we hit the regression phase. So in order to deal with stressful changes, a student may only try to surround himself with people of his or her own culture. So this is when you walk into the hallway or the lunchroom and you see all of the kids from Mexico hanging out together, or all of the adults from Japan hanging out together. This is normal. They're not trying to say, they're not acculturating. It's at this point, in order to deal with the stress of what's going on in their new life, they have to surround themselves with that language that allows them to relax, and a culture that allows them to relax. Just think about being in a classroom for 8 to 10 hours a day in a second language. By the end of the day, how would you feel? I can tell you that in my face-to-face classrooms, when I'm teaching pre-service teachers, and I have a shock language experience where I bring someone in, I kind of hide out in the hallway or in the background, and I bring somebody in to teach the first half an hour of my class in a second language. I observe what's going on. People start tuning out. They start drawing in their book. They start looking at other things. They will take out their phones and start texting. because it's uncomfortable, and that's only after 30 minutes. Think about doing this for 8 to 10 hours of a day. Many of my students will, by the end of the day, have headaches. Many of them develop migraines. They will be pale. They will really show the signs of overstimulation or sensory overload. It really can become very difficult for these students. So we really need to understand what they're going through and understand that their behaviors of anger or depression might be related to this phase here, this number 3. Then we go into a recovery phase. Now the student has learned some things, catching on to how the processes work in their new place, and now they're feeling like they're getting a hold of it. They're understanding why we act the way we act and why we say the things we say. If someone looks at you and says, "Shut up," they actually mean it in a fun way of, "Wow, I can't believe you said that," instead of, "Shut up, I don't want to hear you anymore." So they're starting to understand the craziness of how we do what we do and say what we say. Now, when they hit that level 5, they're so accustomed to what we do that they might have what we call re-entry shock. If they go back to their city or town or village or wherever they have come from, they might have re-entry shock. And some of you may feel this when you go back home to visit your family. Even if you're in the same language, going back can be shocking and lead to feelings that you may not have wanted to feel. That is re-entry shock. Now, when we look at this culture shock phase, it does not always happen in this nice little pattern. This little section here is called a U-curve. So when you read about the U-curve in culture shock, they're talking about starting here, coming down, and coming back up. But sometimes students can be in the 1, 2, 3, go back to 2, be at the 4 phase. And now, especially with adult language learners, if we put them into a higher level class, all of a sudden they're back in the level 3. They just got a hold of all of that level 2 language, and we're going to move them up into a level 3 class, and now they're going to regress a bit. They're going to feel, once again, they're starting over. So for those of you in the adult learning context, where classes are broken up by levels, broken up by these proficiency levels, then as the students go up this ladder, you might see some regression back. But this is just so important to remember when we're teaching our ELLs. Now, keeping this in mind, we want to work to understand something called culturally responsive teaching. Okay, this is one of the vocabulary words. Let me refocus here. Culturally responsive teaching. Now, culturally responsive teaching takes into account culture shock and takes into account the different language levels. So we're going to say culture shock plus language levels equals, this is still a little blurry, isn't it? Equals differentiated teaching. And we are differentiating our teaching or modifying our teaching in order to be responsive to where our students are. So if we have a student who is in that level 3 phase here, this regression phase, and we ask them to do some sort of a presentation in class, my guess is it's not going to happen. We really want to take into account where our students are in this phase and what language level they're at. So if we're at, so imagine if we are at the level 1 or 2 beginning and we're at the level 2 in culture shock, oy vey, that's going to be quite a bit of stress. So for a student who is newer to us, who's going through culture shock, We need to be patient, constant patience. We need to always use visuals. In my K-12 classroom, I had the agenda on the board every single day. So we'd start out with music, if it was music day, so I made sure to have some music notes there. If we had math next, then I would make sure to put math symbols beside it. If we had reading next, I would attempt to draw a book. But the idea is to help my student to have less language proficiency still understand what's going on in my classroom. If we had gym, this was usually the kids' favorite, so we did a Yahoo type dance. So they learned the word yay right away. In my adult classroom, I still did agendas because it's important that when students are new to us or are learning a language, that our environment is somewhat predictable. So even here, I would talk about how we're going to review yesterday. So I might put a calendar here with all of these, and eventually they would understand that we're going to review yesterday. Okay, and then we might talk for a while. So then, there might be this symbol like this, where we're talking. Then we're going to learn vocabulary. So I would put words, words. I know that's not a picture, but that's one of the first words we typically learn when we're learning language is words, words, words. If I had mostly Spanish speaking, I might put vocabulario here. That way, or palabras, palabras, palabras. That way, I'm still using some of their language. For my Japanese and Korean students, I might have them come up here and write the word in their language on the board for me because I am not familiar with that. So I would still do my best to make everything visual. And in this way, I am responding to the stress they're going through. So I am lowering the stress by putting those pictures in there, and they start to associate, oh, music, that's right. So when they hear me say, line up for music, oh, that's right, I can picture in my head what we're doing. And their language levels. It's very important. As students climb this ladder of language learning, we can use less and less pictures, even though we want to include pictures with new vocabulary. But at these lower levels, we really want to make sure we are being as culturally responsive as possible, understanding where they are in culture shock and where they are in the language learning continuum. Now, for students who struggle and come to us as language learners, but are stuck in this cycle of language learning, we call them long-term English language learners, LT, so long-term. This is something in the K-12 context that is very, very researched and paid attention to, because if we have students who are in an ESL setting for more than 6 years, they have now become long-term ELLs. At this point, we need to start understanding what is going on. Are we having a language issue and acculturation? And acculturation is not assimilation. Acculturation is when they're taking on both cultures and learning to live biculturally. So what is going on? This is where we need to really start understanding what is happening. And for those of you in the K-12 context, you will certainly read about that this week. Now, something else we need to consider when we're teaching ELLs is this idea of surface and deep culture. Especially in K-12 when we're trying to do culturally responsive teaching. And we start bringing in, something I do was bring in the Cinderella stories from all different cultures. That, when we talk about the themes, cultural themes, and we talk about why people might believe the way they believe based on the books we're reading, Now we're exploring deep culture because we're exploring the why. Okay? Surface culture, then, think holidays, dress. These are only the things we can see. Okay? Those are only the things we can see. Whereas deep culture are why people think the way they do. So when we think we're being culturally responsive by bringing in holidays and, oh, we're going to celebrate Cinco de Mayo or going to celebrate Chinese New Year, that's great, but it's still surface culture, something we can see. What is the why behind that? What is the why behind Cinco de Mayo? And a lot of people in the U.S. do not know that. They think it's the Mexican independence when it's really just the independence of one state or one region of Mexico. For the Chinese New Year, why do they do it at a different time than we do in the U.S.? What is different about their calendar? That's getting into the why. Why in some countries is the year not 2018 or 2019? Why is it a different year? That gets into the why and the deep culture. Okay, we really want to explore that when we're talking about culture responsive teaching. All right, so to continue, we talked about that I+1 when we're working with students. Remember, we want to give them language at their level, but we want to also give them that challenge. So we want to make sure we're reaching them in a way that they're understanding, they have comprehensible input, because we want them to have comprehensible output, right? Comprehensible output means that they're able to be understood, that the language coming in is sufficient enough and meaningful enough that they can turn that language around and push it out and tell us what they're thinking about a topic. Very, very important for our students. The last thing I want to go over is this concept of interlanguage. So when students are learning language, and we're in this 1, 2, 3 range here, they are oftentimes going to switch between their two languages. And if you have learned a language, you will understand that there are some times when you're thinking and you can only say a word in one of the languages. That happens to me quite a bit, even though I may be a level 3 in Spanish. I speak enough to get around a good rate on taxis. There are some words that I just can't say in English because they don't mean the same. And you will find out with your students that even though they're speaking to you, they will say a word in their language because the meaning to them doesn't exist in English. Also, we'll have students speaking in both languages. So if you keep in mind that inter means within, that means they're within two languages. They're working within two languages, and oftentimes this will take on a grammar of its own. You'll hear things and say things that the words are in English, but the grammar might be in the first language. We're going to put L1 for first language and L2 for English. So the grammar might be in L1. How they're saying it. So my daughter is going through this quite a bit with learning German because it's very different, not very, but it has verb cases and prepositions and possessive pronouns that we just do not use in English. So she's saying the words in German, but her grammar is more English. And this is a very normal part of language learning. And what's interesting is students will know it one day. So let's say you're on day 1 of a lesson and they've got it. You assessed them and they've got it. They know it. They come back on day 2 and they have no clue what you're saying. This is normal. Think about the connections the brain is making. They need to be learning the language and context more than one day in a row in order for them to understand. So if they're walking out their day 1 and they come in day 2 and they do not remember, do not feel destroyed. Do not feel you failed, and do not feel the student is lazy. This is a normal part of the process. One of the things we talk about in language is we can take 3 steps forward and 4 steps back, especially when we bring in new language or a new level, because we're following this pattern. If we think about, oh, we were a 4 one day, and then we come in the next day and we have some new information from another class or another context, it might knock us back down into a 3 for everything going on in that classroom. So it really is teaching English as a second language really is solving multiple mysteries at one time, and it never gets old, and it never is the same day twice. So that is your week 1 vocabulary. If you have any questions, make sure to ask your instructor. Have a very successful week.